should be able now to see the beginning of the presentation. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So, folks, first of all, belatedly, but good evening, and thank you all for joining this webinar. I'd like to start with a little request, and I'm going to say this because I've been already approached on social media, people telling me, don't use the word annexation, say extension of sovereignty, and so on and so forth. And I'd like to ask you, please don't catch me on terminology. I know that terminology is important. I do appreciate that. But if I happen to say the West Bank and I forget to say Judea and Samaria or the opposite, please don't consider that I'm making a political point by saying that, okay? Let's just it is important, but just for the purpose of this webinar, let's focus on substance rather than terminology. And this is a series of 2 webinars. And today we're going to focus on Trump's plan. And then on the next seminar, on the 10th of June, it's a Wednesday, next Wednesday, we're going to focus specifically on annexation. And why do I bundle together these 2 things? Well, the truth is I don't. They are tightly bound together. Okay, and I'll explain why. You see, Israel will not annex anything or will not extend the sovereignty over anything without a green light, without an expression of support from the Trump administration. And the Trump administration will not give that green light, will not give that support, except in a larger framework of Israel committing itself, or the Israeli government committing itself to Trump's vision for peace. Okay, it's a quid pro quo here. And so it would be wrong to talk about one thing without the other. They come together. Okay, it's a pair, it's a couple. You only get one if you commit to the other. And so Trump's plan, the first thing I'd like to address is, it's always interesting to understand who likes it and who doesn't like it. And the kind of, convenient way to look at it is conventional wisdom, if you wish, is Israelis love the Trump plan, Palestinians hate it. And also, very much, I think, in the UK, the right wing loves it, the left wing hates it. Except that might be true in the UK. It's not necessarily true in Israel, you see. Gantz, who's considered a centrist, has committed himself to Trump's peace plan. Even some people in the Labour Party don't mind the plan. Who hates it? The settler, not all settlers, but the settler umbrella group, the representative body, really hates this plan. They called it poisonous recently. And also the kind of harder left merits also really don't like this plan. And so, it's not quite a matter of right wing versus left wing. In fact, I would say that the harder right wing and the harder left wing really don't like the plan, and the kind of middle and center right, center left accept it, if not love it. And so not all Israelis, of course, as you understand, like it. As for the Palestinians, the truth is we don't know. We know what the leadership thinks, but as for the Palestinians on the street, they don't live in a democracy. They don't have freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of public debate. And so we don't really know. I doubt that they all know the details of the plan and so on. Now, if it's not a matter of right wing versus left wing, what actually drives the attitude towards this plan, and indeed towards, in general, towards peace proposals? To try and provide an answer to this, I'm afraid I'm going to have to take you to 1937. I really hate doing this, but it's just for one slide, don't worry. In 1937, the British government, who was then ruling the Mandate of Palestine, sent a kind of commission of inquiry to the place to see who's right and who's wrong in the conflict. And they came up with this formula: a conflict of right with right. So it's not that one side is right and the other wrong. They're both right, kind of, and they both have rights. Now, if you think about it, that's not so unusual. You know, I have the right to do anything I want in my home, but if I'm going to play very loud music, I'm going to impinge on my neighbor's right to have a quiet afternoon. And so what are we going to do then? Hopefully we're going to head for the pub, have a pint of something, and try to accommodate each other, negotiate a little bit, and come up with an agreement that would say, I don't know, maybe I turn it down at certain times, and he's going to install double glazing, something along those lines. But there's another type of conflict as well. Conflict of right versus wrong. If I have £100 in my wallet and somebody steals it, I'm not going to seek an accommodation with a thief. I'm going to seek justice. I'm going to call the police, and I want him to return my money. So the way we see the conflict drives our attitude towards how it's going to be resolved. And not just that, but it drives our attitude to attempts at conflict resolution, to peace proposals. So if I have a situation of conflict and somebody comes with a proposed solution, it depends how I see the conflict. If I see it as a right with right conflict, then chances are, how am I going to measure the proposed solution? I'm going to compare it with the current situation, right? And hopefully I'm going to see an improvement. If that improvement is sufficient, if it brings me to a situation where I can live with it, then I'm going to be happy, I'm going to make a deal. Even if the improvement is not good enough, chances are that I'm going to, negotiate. Maybe make a counter proposal, try to improve the terms, because I see an improvement. If, however, I see the conflict as a conflict of right with wrong, he stole me the £100, and you come and say, well, he'll give you back 40. I'm not going to compare it with the current situation. I could. In the current situation, I have nothing. He has my £100. I have nothing. But that's not how I'm going to see it. I'm going to compare it with what I perceive as justice, okay? It's my £100. And what I'm going to see is not the additional £40 you propose, you offer me. I'm going to see the £60 that I'm losing. I'm going to see a deficit of justice here. And that's not going to make me very happy. And more than that, chances are I'm not going to want to negotiate any further, because if that's your approach, I mean, he stole me £100 and you want to give me 40, why would I negotiate? If you give me 45, I'm going to accept. If you give me 50, I'm going to accept. No. Maybe if you give me 99, I'll reluctantly accept, right? So I'm not going to negotiate any further. And that brings us to that kind of situation where different people look at the same thing and see different things. One of them sees the half full glass and the other the half empty glass. If you look at this bit from I lifted it from the plan itself, from the document, if you see the conflict as right with right, then, you know, it provides the Palestinians don't have a state now, and it provides them with a state. So it's positive. But if you see it as a conflict of right versus wrong, then you see what's missing. Okay, you see the limitations. You see, you know, what's wrong in the plan, or what looks wrong in the plan. So this is a generalization because, you know, a lot of Israelis will be here, but most Israelis and the official Israel sees the conflict as a right with right conflict. That's why they want to negotiate. And the American position is very close to the Israeli one. The Palestinians on the other side, Hamas and even PLO, Fatah, they see it, they tend to see it as a right with wrong type of conflict. You know, this is our country and you came from somewhere, from Europe, and took it from us, and now, you know, you want to give us something. And what about Europe? Or again, it's a generalization, because Europeans will have all kinds of positions. But the European Union, if I'm trying to understand the European Union position, I think I see it a little bit more complex. It's as if they're saying this maybe started as a right with right conflict, but then it moved into a right with wrong. Currently, it moves into a right with wrong situation because Israel is the more powerful side, and the Palestinians are weak, and so the Palestinians are oppressed. That kind of thinking. Now, I talked about the current situation. It's worth, you know, just a couple of slides looking at the situation now, and the situation, especially in the West Bank or Judea and Samaria. And the situation now is the result of agreements that have been signed 25 years ago, the Oslo agreements. And according to the Oslo agreements, the West Bank or Judea and Samaria have been divided into 3 areas. Area A, which is about 18% of the West Bank, includes all Palestinian major cities, and it is controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area B is a little bit bigger, and there the governance is divided. The civilian governance is Palestinian Authority, the security is Israel. What does that mean? It means that if I want to build a house, I don't need an Israeli building permit. I need a Palestinian building permit in Area B. But if I throw stones at Israeli soldiers, then it's the Israeli army that's going to nab me.
Area A, that's quite useful, that map.
I know.
And then we have Area C, which is the bigger one, 60% of the West Bank, and there it's complete Israeli control. And very interestingly, that's where all Israeli settlements are. And also interesting, the Palestinian population in Area C is relatively small. It's relatively sparsely populated, okay? In Area C, because it's complete Israeli control, if I want to build a house in Area C, I need an Israeli permit, an Israeli building permit. And aside from the Oslo agreements, there is also East Jerusalem, which many countries consider to be occupied by Israel. But Israel has, from its point of view, from the point of view of Israeli law, it has annexed East Jerusalem, or expanded its sovereignty over East Jerusalem. So, you know, we're talking about annexation today. Well, some annexation has already happened in East Jerusalem. It's also interesting to look at the population in these areas. As I said, the Israeli settlers are in Area C, and the Palestinian population in Area C is relatively small, but many countries consider also Jews who live in East Jerusalem neighborhoods to be illegal settlers, okay? Now, I said that it's difficult to know what the Palestinians want, what the Palestinians think, and that's true, but we can have opinion polls. Now, I normally disregard opinion polls. I don't believe in them. Most of them are politicized. You know, you ask the questions to get certain answers, but some of them are better than the others. This one, I believe it's better than most. It's always interesting to know who's providing the money. In this case, the money comes, the funding comes from the European Union. And we know what the European Union wants. It wants the two-state solution. But it's also supervised by a rather reputable German institution. And the first question they asked is the obvious one. Do you support or oppose the two-state solution? And these were the results. Okay. So at this point, they usually finish the job. They publish a press release and they say something like, there is still a small majority on both sides in favor of the two-state solution, but the window of opportunity is closing and so on. But these pollsters knew something that many people in the region understand, but very few people in Europe understand, which is that the Palestinians and Israelis might both use the words two-state solution. They use the same words, but they mean two completely different things. And so if we try to spell out what this two-state solution means in practical terms, then the situation changes. In this case, you can see Palestinian support has dropped, the Israeli support has increased. And we can design various package deals and test them, okay? For instance, this one gives us this, okay? There isn't, but no matter what package deal you design, you're not going to find a package deal that garners a majority support on both sides, okay? Impossible. They support two states, the slogan, but when you come to the, you know, actual practicalities of it, you cannot find a deal that satisfies a majority on both sides. This is the least known secret in the business, but many people understand it, even in Europe. And it's impossible. If I try to increase the support among the Palestinians, I automatically decrease the support among Israelis. You can't find, folks, they've been lying to you. There isn't a majority support on both sides for the two-state solution, not for the practical thing. And now, if you're doing a poll on behalf of the European Union and you come up with these results, the European Union wants the two-state solution. Many people want the two-state solution. Then what do? I'll tell you what we do. Let's not look at the Israelis for the moment. You know, we'll persuade them later. Let's focus on the Palestinians. What we do is we look at the ones that rejected the deal and we offer them something else. We offer them some money. In fact, a big amount of money, not to them personally, but to the future Palestinian state, which is supposed to give them a better life and so on and so forth. If I do that, then you can see I only do that with the ones that oppose the deal, because the ones that support it are okay. So you can see that almost a third of the ones that oppose the deal now support it, okay? If you give us this deal and then some money, we'll change our minds. And that's exactly the central message, the central idea of Trump's plan, okay? It's no longer land for peace, it's land and money for peace, or land and prosperity for peace, or land and a better life for peace, okay? But And you know, when you heard that, you might have heard that the Trump plan is new, is innovative, is a breakthrough. Well, some aspects may be new, but this idea of an economic incentive isn't new. It's been there for years. It's been used before. Where this plan is somewhat different is that the economic framework, the economic part of the document is much, much more detailed. In fact, as you can see, is double the size of the political one, more than double the size. It's much more detailed than the political framework. Usually it's the other way around. Usually the political one is very detailed and then they say, we'll give you some money. But this one is different. And it's interesting that this has barely been reported in the media. You can see here the BBC, they list the key issues of the Trump Middle East plan, but they don't say anything about the economic aspects, nothing. And much of the media, not just the BBC, much of the media, that was the situation. And I think it's interesting because, you know, if you are a Palestinian, if you support the Palestinians, if you want them to have a better life, well, just by removing Israeli rule from over them, they're not going to automatically get a better life. I mean, you know, Israel has never ruled Jordan. But if I compare Jordan with Israel, on every single parameter, Jordan falls short. And why do I take Jordan? Well, Jordan and Israel had kind of a similar starting points in life, okay? The Palestinians don't have that starting point. They have a lower starting point, so it's even worse. Now, before I go into the actual plan, into the nitty-gritty, one more thing that I wanted to look at. What is this document? I mean, I keep calling it a plan. It calls itself a vision. What is a vision? Is it a diktat? This is what you have to do. Is it a proposal? You might wish to do that. Is it food for thought? What is it? According to the BBC, it's very clear.
Palestinians don't like what they see. It is not a peace negotiation. It's a set of terms which the Americans, with very strong Israeli backing, are effectively dictating to the other side in a very long-running conflict. Made them their own. It is not the deal of the century for Palestinians because they look at it, instead of seeing a peace proposal, a basis for negotiation, they see essentially a something that's going to work. That's because the Palestinians are effectively being told to take it or leave it.
So, according to the BBC, it's not a peace negotiation. There's nothing negotiable there. It's a surrender document. It's a diktat. It's take it or leave it. Let's see what the main architect of this plan has to say for himself.
So this creates a framework for the Palestinian leadership. I don't know if they'll seize it or not, but if they truly want to have a state and all the things that they have spoken about for years that they aspire for, it's time to come to the table. And if you have issues with different parts of the plan, sit at the table, negotiate. If you don't like where the line is drawn, try to move the line. If you don't like one of the terms, change the term. But there's a lot of flexibility that can be had if they come to the table together.
So according to Jared Kushner, it's negotiable. In fact, you can move the lines, you can change the terms. There's a lot of flexibility. Just come to the table and negotiate. That's what he says. But in fact, that's what the plan itself says. It calls itself a basis for a negotiated peace agreement. It even has a section about the conduct of the sides during negotiations. So what does this mean? This means that they envisage not just negotiations, but longish negotiations, because they don't introduce such a section if it's if the negotiations take days or weeks. They're envisaged as taking many months, perhaps years. And the sides have to behave themselves during those years. Israel to cease settling, no demolitions, and the Palestinians, no international lawfare, and no more salaries for terrorists, and the United States takes certain commitments on themselves, and so on and so forth. And so, to me, I don't really understand where the BBC, and not just the BBC, where some parts of the media got that idea that it is not negotiable. I read the document from cover to cover, and that's sad, such a sad person. I read it and I couldn't find anything. Everywhere it says that it's negotiable. So that's simply wrong there. Okay, it is a negotiable proposal. Now, before I go into the actual provisions of the plan, I'd like to take just a few questions. If there are, Judy, if there are any questions already, or somebody wants to ask a question or two before I continue.
Hello, Noru. Yes, there are a few questions. I don't know necessarily from the beginning of the plan, but anyway, let's go with what we've got. So I think you've dealt with this, but Jeremy Brown says that the Trump plan is supposed to be a two-way plan. What's in it for Abbas and his followers? Do you want a second question?
Okay, well, I'll deal with this first, Judy, and we'll see in a moment that this is, however you want to call it, whether you like it or you don't like the plan, it is a two-state plan. So what's in it for Abbas and his followers? Well, first of all, in it, there's a state. There might not be the state that they wanted. There might not be perfect. It is negotiable, but there's a state. Okay, that's the first thing. There are other things as well, but we'll go through them one by one in a moment.
Okay, I've got a second question. Alison Williams wants to know, what chance do you think there is if annexation proceeds, as it could lead to a one-state solution, and would this possibly be acceptable to all parties?
Well, I can tell you, because I'm Israeli, and I can tell you it's certainly not acceptable to Israelis. One good question would be, is it what the Palestinians want? Okay, because maybe if they're told, look, the state that you're getting is not what you want, maybe they'll turn around and say, you know, we want one state. Look at this. This is from another opinion poll, okay? So if you ask Europeans, they will tell you, oh, I spoke with some Palestinians and they told me they don't want two states. They want a single democratic state with rights for everybody and so on and so forth. Well, it depends. If you talk with Palestinians, which these people usually talk, which are basically activists of the PLO, then that's what you hear. But if you do an opinion poll among Palestinians, you find other things. Because believe it or not, Palestinians have a Palestinian nationalism, just like we Jews have a Jewish nationalism, Zionists. They have their own, and the one-state solution, just like it's not satisfactory for us, leaving aside the fact that it's not practical, I don't believe it can be implemented without a huge bloodshed. But even if it were, it's not a solution for somebody who has national aspirations, okay? Sharing a country with another people is not a good enough solution for somebody who wants self-determination, who wants national self-determination. And they have national aspirations just like we do, okay?
So I have a question. If you say that from the Palestinian perspective, it's right versus wrong, is there ever a way forward out of that?
Very, very good question. I believe there is a way forward because opinions and positions are changing. You know, I was born in, as you heard, I was born in Romania. I spent my youth in Romania. I know everything there was to know about this world of communism and the communist bloc and so on. And if you asked me sometime in the 80s, if you asked me whether, you know, the Berlin Wall is going to fall, I would have told you, are you crazy? No, that's never going to happen. And yet within a short stretch of time, it did happen. I've seen the world changing in my lifetime. I've seen the world changing before my very eyes. And so I'm not going to stand here and say, you know, because we have a certain situation now, we're condemned to this situation forever. I think it's not a matter of optimism, it's a matter of realism, to understand that opinions and positions are changing in time. Shall we move on, Judy, because we have a bigger, much bigger questions and answer sessions at the end.
Sure, that's fine.
So, okay, I should have done this before, but better late than never. Because of my great respect for the BBC, I'm going to use their framework to analyze this, except I'm going to add a thing or two, okay? So first of all, Palestinian statehood. The plan calls itself a two-state solution plan, and it talks about a state, a sovereign state of Palestine as the nation state of the Palestinian people, okay? But not everybody agrees. For instance, Ian Black, writing for the Guardian, he says, no, come on, be serious. This is not a state. At best, it's limited autonomy he has, because it has it's truncated, it's demilitarized, and so on and so forth. You know, they have to disarm Hamas in Gaza. How can you call it a state if you have to disarm Hamas? And so, is it a state or isn't it a state? That's the first thing we've got to clarify. Now, the easiest thing is to go to the international convention that defines what is a state. And this convention sets 4 criteria. A state is an entity that has a permanent population, which Palestine has, a defined territory, which Palestine would have after the peace agreement, a government, arguably they have that already, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states, which the plan expressly says they would have after the peace agreement, and arguably they have already. So this is a very, very simple framework, and basically what it says, if it looks like a state, it moves like a state, it quacks like a state, it's a state, folks, okay? And so I could leave it there. I could stop and tell you, Ian Black is wrong, it's a state, that's it. But I don't want to be legalistic. I don't want to be overly simplistic. We want to get to the truth here. So I've done a bit more analysis. I took the state of Palestine as envisaged in Trump's plan and compared it on one hand with Scotland, which is autonomous, self-rule and so on. And on the other hand, with an independent state, Iceland. Why Iceland? I don't know, because it ends in land like Scotland, you know. But if you, I'm not going to go line by line through this, but if you look at this, I would say that the state of Palestine as envisaged in Trump's plan resembles more Iceland than it does Scotland, but it's not exactly the same, especially in terms of security. It doesn't have all the powers that an independent state has. Why did I take Scotland, by the way? You remember the limited autonomy bit? Well, Scotland has a high degree of autonomy. So I compared it with Scotland and not with Tibet. Tibet is also called an autonomy, but it isn't. But Iceland undoubtedly is an independent state, but is it 100% sovereign? Iceland, well, you know, this kind of notion of perfect sovereignty of states is a bit of a myth, because quite frankly, every time a state signs an international treaty, it may be a peace treaty, it may be other type of international treaty, it gives up some of the control, some of the sovereign control over its borders, over its territory, and so on and so forth. So, you know, when I wrote here complete powers, complete control, it's not quite complete, okay? And by the way, it's not just treaties, it's other things as well. Israel is a sovereign state, and as a sovereign state, it wants its capital in Jerusalem. But other countries don't necessarily agree with that. And many of them keep their embassies in Tel Aviv. So what you're going to do if Israel doesn't like this, but if you're going to have trade with these countries, what you're going to do? But very interestingly, and it hasn't been reported by and large in the media, the plan, Trump's plan, also sets limitations on certain aspects of Israeli sovereignty. For instance, Israel is required to give the Palestinians facilities in its own ports, in its major ports, for the state of Palestine, not just to use, but actually to manage. And the sovereignty of the state of Israel in those places is limited to security. Everything else belongs to the state of Palestine. Including Israel has to facilitate transportation from there to the state of Palestine, and the state of Palestine will even collect taxes, Palestinian taxes, in those places. And not just that, Israel is also required to set aside, to earmark a site on the shore of the Dead Sea for a Palestinian resort. The sovereignty over the territory, in principle, it's still going to be Israeli territory, but it's going to be used exclusively for a resort for Palestinians. And other things as well, we'll see in a moment. But while the plan provides a Palestinian state, it's not without conditions. There are conditions as well. The state of Palestine has to be democratic. It has to tackle corruption. It has to demilitarize the population, so only the government has, control of the military, and some other terms and conditions. And again, different people will look at this in different ways. Some people will say, wonderful, so the Palestinians will not only have a state of their own, but they'll actually live better. They'll live in a free state, and so on. Other people, however, will say something else, will say, who are you, the United States? Who are you, the state of Israel, to tell the Palestinians how they should govern themselves? That's such enormous chutzpah. It's unheard of. Is it really unheard of? Who wrote the Constitution of Japan? Anyone knows who wrote the Constitution of Japan? Some of you know, I'm sure. The US occupation forces, the military of the US, wrote the Japanese Constitution after World War II. Yes, they employed afterwards some Japanese scholars to put a Japanese veneer on it. But basically, it was written by the US military, by US officers, okay? And it includes all kind of, conditions. Joe Biden got in trouble a few years ago when he reminded the Japanese about that. He was accused of being insensitive. Well, he might have been insensitive, but he told the truth. It's the truth. Who wrote the Constitution of West Germany? If your answer is the US military, you're wrong. The Germans themselves wrote their own constitution. But after they wrote it, it had to be approved by the occupying forces. So that's not unusual. You know, you had a war, a bloody and bitter war, before you occupied some territory, before you allow the vanquished to be independent, you want to be sure that the new government, you know, isn't going to start it all over again. You're not going to end up in the same position later. Okay, now let's move on to the next bit, Jerusalem. Jerusalem says the plan. On one hand, it says Jerusalem will be the capital of both states. But on the other hand, it says the border between the two Jerusalems, or between Jerusalem and Al-Quds, will be the current security barrier. That means it's not through the middle. That means that Palestinians can have their capital, and they can call it Al-Quds, or they can call it whatever they want, but it's in the outskirts of Jerusalem. It's in the neighborhoods on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And again, different people will look at this in different ways. So some people will say, hold on, we think that Israel has annexed the East Jerusalem illegally. And so the plan leaves Israel in possession of this illegally annexed territory. And also the old city will be under Israeli sovereignty. The old city is important to all three religions. And also, as I said, these neighborhoods for the Palestinian capital are not really Jerusalem. They're the outskirts of Jerusalem. It's like saying your parliament will not be in Westminster, it'll be in Hampstead, something like that. But other people will take a different view. Other people will say, well, hold on, Israel has control over everything right now. And so it's Israel that relinquishes something. It's Israel that gives something here. Not the Palestinians. The Palestinians don't give anything here. They take. Okay? And also, some people will say, well, many Israelis, you know, will not necessarily like this because it leaves them with 300,000 Arab residents of East Jerusalem who are in principle entitled to Israeli citizenship. And not just in principle, by the way, because the plan says something else. The plan says East Jerusalem Palestinians can choose. They can choose Israeli citizenship. They can choose Palestinian citizenship and still remain where they are in Israeli Jerusalem with rights, or they can choose to stay what most of them are now, which is permanent residents of Israel, permanent residents of Jerusalem. Also, the plan talks about the religious importance of Jerusalem. It recognizes the importance of Jerusalem in Islam as well. And but it entrusts Israel with safeguarding the religious sites of all religions. Why? Because it says they did well, you know, in the past. Since Israel has had control over these sites, they've been open to the public. Everybody was able to go there and worship and so on. But very importantly, while the safeguarding is given to Israel, and the language chosen here is very careful, so they don't talk about sovereignty, they talk about safeguarding. But the safeguarding doesn't come without conditions. One condition is to maintain a religious status quo. So Israel is given the safeguarding, but it's not allowed to change things. And not just that. Very interestingly, Israel is required to, again, set aside a certain site on the Israeli side of Jerusalem, in Atarot, and make it into a special tourist zone for the state of Palestine. And not just any tourism, but Muslim pilgrimage. So this site will be used for Muslim pilgrimage to Jerusalem, including fast-track transport to the sites and so on and so forth. And not just that, money as well. Israel is supposed to set aside some of the income from tourism and use it to maintain these sites, to develop these sites. And then, again, with all due respect to the BBC, I'm going to bundle together these three items, because I think we're talking about territorial issues. I'm going to talk about them together. The plan says that it delivers significant territorial expansion to the Palestinians. That's right with right. Remember the right with right conflict? That's right with right language. Basically, what it says is right now, the Palestinians control area A. They have some control in area B. We're going to give them much more territory to control. But if you take the opposite view of right versus wrong, you're not going to see this necessarily as a fair compromise. Something else that hasn't been quite reported in the media is that the plan says something else as well. The territory of the Palestinian state should be reasonably comparable in size to West Bank plus Gaza. Reasonably comparable. Previous proposals have put numbers to this. They said 90%, 93%, 95%. This plan doesn't. It leaves it kind of vague. And you can take your own, please, can you, okay, I'm muted. Okay, so you can make your own opinion about this. I believe that that vagueness is an opening for negotiations, because, you know, it hasn't been pinned down. Sorry. Now, the BBC says, and it's mistaken, the BBC talks about a state in 70% of the West Bank and all of Gaza. What they miss is they miss something else, that there will be some land from within Israel that is given to the Palestinian state. And this is not a new idea. This was in previous proposals as well, swapping land. In previous proposals, Israel was supposed to annex some of the settlements and compensate the Palestinian state with land from within Israel. And this plan also does the same. You can see here two portions of two pieces of territory attached to the Gaza Strip. And also this one, this is not part of the West Bank. It's Israeli land, but attached to the West Bank. And also, although it's not entirely clear on the map, it looks like also in the north of the West Bank, there is some land that is attached. And something else as well. The triangle communities. What are the triangle communities? There are I never understood why they're called triangle, but there are a number of Arab towns and villages. The inhabitants are Israeli citizens. These towns and villages, they were in 1949 in the armistice negotiations with Jordan, they were supposed to go to the West Bank or to Jordan as it happened. But for different reasons, they were left within Israel. And so their inhabitants were given Israeli citizenship. And now the plan comes and says, contemplates the possibility, subject to agreement of the parties, to annex these towns and villages to the state of Palestine. This has been somewhat reported in the media, but it has been generally tendentious reporting. What they said is Israel will take the citizenship away from these people and transfer them to Palestine. That's not what the plan says. It says subject to agreement of the parties and so on. And meanwhile, both parties, certainly the Palestinians, don't like that, but Israel also said we're not going to do this. But you never know, because in the Middle East, when they say no, it's not clear that it's going to be no, and when they say yes, similarly, it's not so clear. Contiguity is very important in territorial terms. Remember the mantra, contiguous and viable Palestinian state. The plan comes and says, we are going to provide the Palestinians with freedom of movement, with ease of travel throughout the state of Palestine. How are we going to do it? By using state-of-the-art infrastructure, bridges, roads, and tunnels, allowing the Palestinians to move freely throughout the state, even between West Bank and Gaza, without crossing Israeli territory, without encountering checkpoints, without even seeing an Israeli border policeman, nothing. How are we going to do that? Well, we're going to build these motorways in the state of Palestine, and probably in the future also railways. And where these motorways encounter Israeli territory, there will be an overpass or a tunnel, and so they're not going to have to see any Israeli even going from the West Bank to Gaza. And not just that, not just inside the Palestinian state, but also on the way to Jordan. So they can go into Jordan subject to the Jordanian legislation and subject to Israeli security, but they can go to Jordan via the same system. So this is an attempt, in my opinion, is an attempt to create what I would call practical contiguity rather than geographical contiguity or geometrical contiguity. Is it a creative idea that might work? Or is it, as has been suggested in some of the media, a state that looks like Swiss cheese? Well, I'll only say that you'll make your own thoughts about it. I'll only say that in conflict resolution, in mediation, we are taught to differentiate between positions and interests of the sides. I don't know if any of you is a mediator, but that's okay. And very simplistically put, positions is what the sides say they want, and interests is what they actually need. So in this case, the position is Palestine should be contiguous and viable. The interest is they should have free and fast movement throughout their country. And what about the settlements? Okay, we heard so much about the settlements, and in previous proposals, first of all, these are, you can see these purple dots here. These are Israeli settlements, and the big ones are here close to the green line, okay? And here, and in the previous proposals, Israel was supposed to annex these large settlements, and as for the others, they would be evacuated, which means Israel would have to move 100,000, 150,000 people, some of them forcibly, probably, and Israel would have to find them housing in Israel, maybe jobs in Israel, and so on. So this creates a political cost and a financial cost, and it creates a kind of disincentive for making a deal. This plan comes and says, no, we'll have none of that. Everybody stays where they are. The Israelis stay where they are and the Palestinians stay where they are. Nobody moves. Nobody moves. How are we going to do that? Well, like this. So Israel will annex the areas with Israeli settlements, except for 15 settlements that that are inside the Palestinian state, and they will become enclaves, bits of Israeli sovereignty surrounded by Palestinian sovereignty. And equally, Palestinians will have enclaves inside Israeli territory where the Palestinians are sovereigns and surrounded by Israeli sovereignty. These two paragraphs from the plan, one of them deals with Palestinian enclaves, one with Israeli enclaves, and they are symmetrical except for one thing. The security responsibility is always Israeli security responsibility in both cases. Okay, so the plan basically, it doesn't say that, but what I understand from this plan, the plan trusts Israel with the security of Palestinians, but it doesn't trust the Palestinians with the security of Israelis. Whether that's fair or not, or maybe it's not fair, but it's practical, you make your own mind. I'll only say as an Israeli that every day tens of thousands of Palestinians cross into Israel for work, and they're not molested. And if they are molested, then the molester will be arrested and thrown in jail. On the other hand, Israelis that move inside the West Bank are frequently molested, and often the molesters, if they're arrested by Israel, they get a salary from the Palestinian Authority, or if they're killed by Israel, then the relatives get a pension from the Palestinian Authority. So maybe, you know, it's not quite fair, but it's practical. Anyway, the Jordan Valley, again about territory. The plan explains, there's an explanation here, very technical, explains that the Jordan Valley is absolutely necessary to the state, to the security of the state of Israel, not just as a bulwark against conventional attacks, for instance, by Iranian forces coming through Jordan, but also with regard to terrorism. Now, when we talk about Jordan Valley, what are we talking about? We're talking about this strip of territory. And so this is the Jordan River, along the Jordan River, and also in the north of the Dead Sea. The south of the Dead Sea is Israeli territory anyway, but the north is part of the West Bank, or was part of the West Bank. Now, we need to honestly ask the question, is this genuine security concern, or as has been suggested in some of the media, look, it's fertile land, it's agricultural land, and Israel just covets it, okay? First of all, is it fertile land? Yes and no is the answer. The northern part here is kind of fertile. I mean, many people in Europe, when we talk about the Jordan River, they imagine the Rhine or the Loire Valley. It's not the Loire and it's not the Rhine. It's a small river. But this part is kind of fertile under the circumstances. Why, by the way? Because Israel built irrigation systems. It wasn't fertile historically, okay? Which is why few Palestinians actually inhabit it. Relatively few Palestinians live here. To the south of this, it's not fertile at all. It's a desert. But also, is it important for agriculture? Yes, it's agricultural land. But, you know, I know that you imagine Israel as an agricultural superpower. Technologically, perhaps it is. But agriculture in Israel is a very small economical sector. It's about 2%, and it employs 1% of the population. And that's the entire agricultural sector in Israel, not the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is a fraction of that. So the explanation that Israel just wants this agricultural land, I think it's a bit, you know, of a red herring. Okay, refugees. Previous proposals talked about a symbolic return of refugees to Israel. They were bandying around numbers, 5,000, 100,000, you know. This plan comes and says, no, 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 no. There will be no return of Palestinian refugees or descendants of refugees to Israel. There will be absorption into the state of Palestine insofar as possible, and they want to. Otherwise, integration in the current host countries, or if other countries want to take some and they want to go there, that's fine. There will be compensation for the refugees, but that's all. There's no return, not symbolic and not otherwise, to Israel. I'm going to not talk about recognition because we talked about statehood, and I think it's included there. But I am going to talk about security, and I have only one thing to tell you about security, which is that the security of Israel is paramount throughout the plan, okay? The plan doesn't want to do anything that might hurt Israeli security, might endanger the existence of Israel, and so on and so forth. That's everywhere in the plan. Now, I'm going to, you know, with all due respect to BBC, just complete their list here because the Palestinians are not so interested in Israeli security, but they are very interested, I can assure you, in Palestinian prisoners. And by the way, the plan calls them prisoners, which is a gesture towards the Palestinians, because Israel doesn't call them prisoners. You know, we call them terrorists or criminals. We don't call them prisoners. But these prisoners are going to be released by Israel in a peace situation, except the ones guilty of murder, attempted murder, or conspiracy to commit murder, and except Israeli citizens. So Palestinians, yes, but Israeli citizens, no. And also Israel will grant amnesty for offenses committed before the peace treaty, and so on. Now I'm coming, and with this I will end. I'm running out of time, but I'm coming to the economic part, and very quickly I'm going to give you just the titles. So there's quite a detailed economic plan for 10 years, and in 10 years it wants to more than double the Palestinian economy, the Palestinian GDP, and also to create more than 1 million, in fact, 1.3 million new Palestinian jobs. It wants to reduce the Palestinian unemployment to European levels. It wants to halve Palestinian poverty rates. And all this is then translated into development goals. You can see here increased Palestinian exports from 17% of GDP to 40% of GDP. Remember, the GDP is also doubling. So this is a tremendous increase in Palestinian exports. Affordable electricity, double the potable water supply, internet, and so on. Boost human capital development, establish at least one Palestinian university in the top 150 in the world. Even some progressive targets, which you know, you wouldn't expect from a very conservative US administration. Increase female labor force participation from 20% to 35%, halve infant mortality, increase life expectancy, improve governance, and so on and so forth. In total, it's costed to 28 billion to be spent in the Palestinian state, mostly, as you can see here, on infrastructure, but also on governance, and also on humanistic things like education, like healthcare, but that's in the Palestinian state, but also some money will be spent in the neighboring countries, presumably to create a network with the Palestinians, a trade network, and also to provide an incentive for these states to support the plan. So in total, we're talking about $51 billion. And it's a very detailed plan. So there are spreadsheets. Every project is detailed. Every project is costed. It's timelined. The bigger projects are detailed in more detail. As you can see here, every such table is a page in the document. So it's a very, very detailed plan. Now, my conclusions, just one slide. As I said, whether one loves it or hates it, I think it depends mostly on one's pre-existing attitude towards the conflict in general. What's the nature of the conflict? Now, is it new? Is it innovative, a breakthrough? Well, first of all, it's a negotiable proposal, as I said. Some of the details are new-ish, but quite frankly, the main principles, the basic principles are not new. We're still talking about two states. We're still talking about economic incentives, swapping land, and so on and so forth. Where there's something brand new is not in the plan. You won't find it in the plan. There's nothing about it in the plan, but it seems to be US policy today. And this is to start implementing it unilaterally if the Palestinians refuse to negotiate. That's new. Until now, Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, John Kerry, they all came with plans. The moment the Palestinians said no, they said, okay, that's it, it's gone. This plan comes and said, you know what, if you don't play ball, we'll start implementing anyway. And again, it's not in the plan. It's outside the plan. The plan says nothing about unilateral implementation, okay? Now, this looks to me like an attempt to give the Palestinian leadership something to lose by not negotiating. Because if you take the European view, they have nothing to lose. Basically, the European says, look, there are occupied Palestinian territories and they're yours. You can have them today, you can have them tomorrow, you can have them in 5 years, in 10 years, whenever you deign to take them, you can have them. You've got nothing to lose, only perhaps to gain. Maybe your situation will be better in the future. And so that doesn't provide much of an incentive to make hard decisions today, okay? Now, will this attempt at pressuring a deal, will it work? I don't think so in the short term, certainly not. The Palestinian Authority, what they will do is they'll wait it out. They'll wait for the results of the US elections in November. They are very attuned from the past. They know very well that in democratic countries, the government changes every now and then. And with the government, the policies change as well. So they'll wait it out. Now, if Trump wins in November, in my opinion, all bets are off. On one hand, we may see a more flexible Palestinian position, if nothing else, because they're running out of money and they're running out of supporters. But on the other hand, we may also see a rather different stance from the Trump administration. We might see a Trump administration that distances itself a bit from Israel and comes closer to the Palestinians. And why am I saying this? Because we know from history, we know from the past that second-term presidents are different from first-term presidents. In the first term, they want to be re-elected. In the second term, they can't be re-elected, and they're thinking about their political and their historical legacy. And I'd like to finish here with a question to you. Before you ask me questions, I'm going to ask you a question and leave you to ponder it. This is the question, okay? I'll leave it a moment on the screen so you can read it. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me. And questions, if you have questions, Judy, are there any questions?
Yes, there are questions.
I think also Noreen Firestone will like to ask a question. Is that right?
She may have. It's one person who has their hand up.
Yeah.
So shall I take the questions first, and then we'll go to the hand
Okay.
up? Okay. So I've got a question as to, given the scattering of the areas of Palestinian control and Israeli control, how can you achieve a geographically unified state?
Okay. Well, first of all, if you look on a detailed map of the world, you might find, to your surprise, I think I did, to my surprise, that a lot of states do not have this unitary territorial unity, that they have enclaves within another state. I don't know if you know, but between Belgium and Netherlands, there are some 40 Dutch enclaves in Belgium and the same number of Belgian enclaves in Netherlands, and so on and so forth. There's a long list of such enclaves. Territorial unity. You know, one of the things that we need to understand is we live in a three-dimensional world where you somehow conditioned, because we look at two-dimensional maps and we're conditioned to think in two-dimensional ways, but actually the world is three-dimensional. And it is possible to create contiguity, as I've shown, by this system of overpasses and tunnels, so they don't even meet, using the third dimension here. It is, at least in principle, it is certainly possible. You know, just to make you laugh, one of my problems with SatNav is when there is an overpass or a tunnel, you don't see it on the SatNav, because the SatNav shows you a two-dimensional picture, but actually there is a third dimension. So that's my answer, Julie.
Okay, so that was a question from Shay. I think I said that wrong at the beginning. So the next question is from Anthony Dellin. He says, settlers against annexation is a big deal. How can they be placated?
Put your questions on before.
Sorry, settlers?
Settlers against annexation is a big deal. How can they be placated?
How can they be what?
Placated.
Placated, okay. Well, no peace plan in the world will satisfy everybody. You know, with past plans, as I showed you, there would have been 100,000 settlers or 150,000 settlers that would have had to be evacuated, that would have had to be moved away from their homes. I mean, you know, we can call these people illegal and whatever kind of epithets you want to give them, but many of these people have been living there. Some of them have been born there. Many of them have been living there for, you know, decades already. So it's not that easy. Now, you know, I agree that the situation with annexation and so on, it's not going to satisfy everybody. But I feel, as an Israeli, that if the current plan was to be, you know, this is how the things are going, this is the, you know, the solution, the ultimate deal, then it, you know, it would pass in the Knesset by a large majority, is my feeling. And as we know, you know, we're talking about a democracy, and the majority ultimately decides. So
the next question is about democracy, but on the other side. I mean, the Berlin Wall, which you gave as an example, which nobody thought would originally happen, but it happened because of the will of the people. How do you see the will of the Arab people happening here? And given that the Palestinian state being democratic may be a precondition, but since no Arab state is democratic, how do you expect that to happen?
I actually expect more Arab states to be democratic, ultimately. As I said, things change, okay? So look at Eastern Europe. I mean, look at the country I was born in, Romania. Romania had been under the communists, you know, in 1989, when there was the revolution, so-called, which was really a coup. But you know, it had been for many decades under the communists. People didn't remember democracy, most people. And yet, you know, people want to be free. This is an inherently human, it's inherent in the human condition, okay? People want to be free. And if you think that Arabs are different, well, today they might be different because of education, because of other things. But ultimately, everybody wants to be free. And Palestinians, by the way, are the most educated among the Arabs. Don't think that Palestinians, you know, are kind of, you know, never. They tend to be most educated among the Arabs. And don't you think that they don't look with a corner, they might not say it, but don't you think that they don't look with a corner of their eye to Israel, and they think, oh, these bastards live better than we do. They're freer than we are. You know, they have a better life. And don't you think that they don't want the same life? And don't you think that they're stupid? They're not stupid. And they understand that it's not just the Israelis. You know, I didn't show you, but in the same opinion poll, look at how they're looking to their own leaders. Their leaders are not popular people, believe me. You know, they see them as dictators, they see them as they are, and they don't like them.
Well, so Samuel...
Excuse me, could I ask a question?
Is that Jack?
No, it's
Irving Gordon. Irving Gordon,
yeah, okay. So there are several areas where we're dealing with dubious truths. For example, the notion that Islam sees part of Jerusalem as being a holy center. We all know what gave rise to that notion, and it's quite dubious. Secondly, the Palestinians have been educated for, say, 50 or 70 years by UNRWA mainly to believe in the right of return and to believe that to kill a Jew is going to take them to heaven and similar. So I want to ask this. If this, how does the deal overcome that sort of dubious truths? And B, have there been any other examples in the history of the world where a deal has been based on non-truths?
Okay, so here's my answer. Okay, first of all, to the dubious truth that Islam considers Jerusalem sacred and so on. Look, I'm not a Muslim, okay, but I can tell you something from my little life experience. You know, I once went into a garage that was run by some Pakistani guys. Pakistanis, not Arabs, not Palestinians. And on the wall in his office, he had the image of Al-Aqsa in the mosque in Jerusalem, okay? And this is a Pakistani guy who, you know, is Muslim, is not an Arab, is not Palestinian. So I don't know. Look, if you want to teach me the history of Islam and that Islam doesn't take notice of Jerusalem, I won't go into that kind of discussion. I think it's pretty clear that today at least some of the Muslims, see Al-Aqsa as important. I don't know if it's the most important thing for them. Obviously, it's the third sacred place. It's not where the first or the second, but there is an importance there, okay? And it's for, you know, if I can't teach them, I can't change it, I can't re-educate them that it's not important, much as I would like to, okay? That's one bit. The other bit, look, I don't think that all Palestinians are fanatic Islamists. Some of them definitely are, definitely are. I don't think all of them. And also, I don't know what is to be gained by, you know, an attitude that basically says, you know, we're forever damned to live. I'm not advocating naivety. Okay, I'm not naive. I understand that it's difficult. I understand that it's about re-educating people, but people can be re-educated. Okay, people change their minds. Let me tell you, you know, the Nazi Germany has been defeated in the war. These were probably the most fanaticized people in history. Okay, but now Germany is democratic. It's one of the most democratic countries. So, you know, things can be changed. It's not easy. It's not fast. There are no easy solutions, but I remain hopeful. If you want to lock yourself, Irving, in you know, kind of a position of forever pessimism, it's your right, but I don't think it's constructive, quite frankly.
Okay, I've got a few more questions. One that relates to what you just said, really. What are the chances of the other Arab states helping the Palestinians to seriously consider this plan?
I think actually there is quite a bit. That's why I said somewhere that the Palestinians are running out of money, or the Palestinian Authority, I should say, is running out of money and out of supporters, because there is pressure today on the Palestinian Authority from Arab states to make a deal. Okay, I don't know if you know, but recently the Emirates, the United Arab Emirates, sent a plane with equipment, ventilators, and so on, you know, medical aid for the Palestinians. But unusually, completely unusually, they sent it to Ben Gurion Airport, okay, to the Israeli airport. It was for the Palestinians, not for Israel. But the fact that an Arab commercial flight landed in Israel was a big deal, okay? So much a big deal that the Palestinian Authority decided, we don't want this equipment. We really, really need it, but we're not going to take it because we don't like that it's being sent to Israel and so on. But if you think about it, that was, believe me, these kind of gestures are not done in a, you know, in a cavalier, casual manner. They are well thought of gestures that signify something. And what it signified in this case, it was a message to the Palestinians, you know, you guys have to be a bit more flexible, because the Arab states have an interest in good relationship to Israel these days. If nothing else, because of the military might that Israel can add in their fight against Iran. They're really, really scared of Iran, and they would like, and the only one in the region that can help them against Iran is Israel.
Okay, so Cynthia says that she disagrees with you that Israelis don't want the
Oh dear.
She said, I believe that most Israelis want the annexation to proceed because Palestinians will never agree to anything, whatever is offered. They've said no to everything so far.
Then I'm glad to tell Cynthia that she doesn't necessarily disagree with me, because I never said that that Israelis don't support annexation. I think most Israelis do support annexation. I didn't say otherwise. Sorry if it came across as if I'm saying that Israelis don't support it. You know, it's my fault. What I meant is not all Israelis support or like Trump's plan. We've seen that some of the settlers don't and some of the hard left doesn't, but most Israelis actually very much like Trump's plan, without doubt. Speaking about annexation, one moment, Judy, just to say that speaking about annexation, the next episode of this, the next webinar will be about annexation, and it's next Wednesday, so on the 10th of June. And I wanted to show you a few of the things that we will deal with. So what's the correct terminology? Pros and cons of annexation. What may be or will be annexed? What exactly? Why now? And why unilaterally? What may be the consequences of eventual annexation? What will or may be the status of the Palestinians in annexed territories? And what should the Board of Deputies say about it? I'm sure you heard quite a bit of discussion about it, so we'll have a bit of discussion here as well. Yes, Judy.
Excellent. Well, I think we said we go on a little bit past 9. So a question here is, do you think there's any mileage in a 3-state solution?
I don't know. You tell me what a 3-state solution is. If we're talking about the West Bank being separate from Gaza, what can I tell you? If you can convince, I don't know who asked that, but if you can convince the Palestinians to accept something like that, I would be entirely happy with such a situation. By the way, the number of potential states is unlimited. You know, there is somebody in Israel who talks about 8 states, 8 Arab Emirates will divide the West Bank and Gaza into 8 Arab Emirates. Okay, there's somebody even that talks about 37 cantons. We're going to put it all together and have 37 cantons in the place. Now, the only problem with that, it's not quite Switzerland, you know.
So finally, the last question is, what if Trump loses in November?
Well, chances are that if Trump loses, the best guess I can give is that we will see a kind of return to Obama-style policies, or maybe not quite like Obama, but, you know, that kind of Obama, John Kerry type of policies, because this is what Joe Biden believes in.
Now, I think Noreen had her hand up before. Is there anything you want to say, Noreen?
I sent a message. I said, Noru, do you really believe that Trump can be trusted? And I do not agree with you that most Israelis think Trump is wonderful. You just need to speak to some of my friends here in Carmiel, especially the Americans.
Well, the key word there is especially the Americans, okay? Because we all know that American Jews, by and large, really don't like Trump. My personal opinions is if Trump had to be elected by Israelis rather than Americans, he would win over Biden. But that's just my personal opinion. Now, can he be trusted? I don't know, and quite frankly, I don't particularly trust him. Let me say, I don't trust him blindly. Certainly, I don't think many Israelis trust him blindly. As I said at the end that I expect, if he does win, I expect him to change his position because he will be a second-term president. So I don't blindly trust him. If, however, you know, people, not necessarily Trump, because let's make something clear. I call this Trump's plan, but it isn't Trump's plan. I doubt that he had much real input into it. I think Kushner and Greenblatt and so on drove the thing, and you know, Trump got it and said, "Thank you very much. I'm going to do a press conference now and take the credit." But if Kushner and so on can bring us to a better situation, closer to peace, perhaps, then I'm happy. You know, I don't have to trust him. I don't have to trust them. Israel is used to trusting only itself. Even the much vaunted relationship, special relationship with the United States, it's a give and take relationship. You know, it's very much, you've seen even with this administration, it's a quid pro quo type of relationship. It's not, Israelis don't expect gifts and don't trust the Americans blindly. They only trust themselves.
Okay, so there are one or two more questions, but
Go ahead.
Actually, no, I'm just seeing some of the people I thought were asking questions are actually saying thank you. So maybe it's a good time to say that was brilliant, just amazing. Sorry about the technical glitches.
They will be mended for the next webinar. Okay, the next webinar we would have learned the lessons.
I hope so. So I'll be mailing out the link for the next webinar fairly soon. And thank you so much. And it was lovely to see so many people at the webinar.
Thanks very much, Noru. Very educational.
Oh no, I thank you very much. Thank you for having me, and it's been a pleasure, and I hope it's been helpful as well.
Loved
I've
it.
muted everybody, so if you all want to say thank you, go for it.
Okay, thank you.
Noru, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Noru.
Thank you.
Thank you, Noru.
Thank you.
Noru, much appreciated.
Shalom Aleichem.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm sorry so many of you got to be called Robert Smith.
That's all right.
Thank you for
But
organizing.
it's a lovely name. It's a lovely name, and he's a lovely bloke. I know him.
It's an old Jewish name, Smith.
as we know, there is someone called Gideon Smith. Probably you know him. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Nora, it was an